We had been planning the camping trip for months. A group of us, 4 friends, decided to head out to a remote part of the forest for a weekend in the wilderness. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. We thought it would be the perfect escape. I should have known better. The first night, things seemed fine. We set up our tents, started a fire, and drank a few beers as the sun set behind the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and earth fresh in the cool evening. We talked about old memories, cracked jokes, and joked about how spooky it might get once it was dark. We laughed at the idea of forest spirits or ghosts, all the typical campfire stories. As the fire flickered low, we finally decided to head to bed. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the rustling of the forest outside lulling me into a peaceful sleep. But I wasn't asleep long. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone, moving around our campsite. I froze, heart racing. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves and twigs. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, rooting around for food. But the sound didn't stop. It kept circling the tents, getting closer and closer. I held my breath, straining to hear more clearly. The steps were too heavy to be any animal I'd heard before, and they didn't seem to have the usual rhythm of an animal's walk. I wasn't sure why, but it felt wrong. I shifted in my tent, quietly unzipping the flap just enough to peek outside. My eyes scanned the dark outline of the forest, searching for movement. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, stood just beyond the edge of the firelight. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it staring at me. I jerked back into the tent, holding my breath. My mind raced, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, or maybe someone from the group trying to mess with me. But it didn't feel like a prank. The air felt thicker, colder, and the silence was suffocating. I waited a few minutes, heart pounding in my chest, before I cautiously opened the tent again. The figure was gone. I convinced myself it was nothing, and slowly drifted back to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I tried to brush off what had happened. Everyone else seemed fine, joking around like nothing was out of the ordinary. We packed up for a short hike deeper into the forest. The trees were denser now, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. There was a strange stillness in the air, but I told myself it was just the quiet of the woods. That afternoon, we set up camp again, deeper into the woods. The place felt more isolated, more remote. As the day stretched into evening, we gathered around the fire once more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. And then, just as the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the campsite, we heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, like a whisper carried by the wind. It wasn't any of us. We all fell silent, straining to hear. The voice was saying something, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost pleading. "Did you hear that?" One of my friends, Jack, whispered. We all nodded, too unnerved to laugh it off. We stood up, eyes darting around the campsite. It came again, this time louder, more desperate. It sounded like someone, maybe a woman, crying for help. We immediately grabbed our flashlights and started searching the forest. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The voice was so clear, so real, that I couldn't understand how it wasn't one of us. We searched for what felt like hours, calling out, shining our lights into the trees. But there was nothing. No one. As we made our way back to camp, we noticed something we hadn't before. The ground around our tents was marked with odd, jagged symbols. Someone, something had been near us. We didn't speak of it aloud, but we all knew something was off. That night, as we lay in our tents, we heard the whispers again. But this time, they were closer. Much closer. The footsteps, too, were back, circling the camp. And this time, I couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever had been watching us, whatever had been whispering, wasn't human. It had never been human. In the morning, we packed up quickly, barely speaking to each other. As we walked back down the trail, I glanced back once more. Just behind the trees, barely visible in the shadows, I saw the figure again, standing still, watching us leave. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. And I never returned to those woods.